Existential-Humanistic Case Conceptualization and Treatment Planning. And I'm going to start off by arguing with myself a little bit. And I'm going to tell you why this project is a waste of time. And then say why maybe it's not. And I want to also start by acknowledging kind of the co-author that's not listed on here. This is a project that my wife and I have been working on for a number of years. So Evelyn Claire Hoffman is been very much a part of the development of this. And that plays a key role in some of the things that I'm going to talk about too, the conversations that we've had too about this. But there are reasons why many existential humanistic therapists have avoided case conceptualization and treatment planning, and there's very, very good reasons for this. That there's concern about diagnosis, and this was talked about some earlier in the Congress. When we started developing this project, one of the things we did was a research project and with existential humanistic therapists, and we asked them about their opinions about diagnosis, and the vast majority say they prefer not to diagnose, but will when it's in the client's best interest, which fits quite well with the panel discussion, the roundtable discussion that there was earlier at the World Congress across the different existential approaches. So the diagnosis and the kind of limited framework of talking about problems that often comes with case conceptualization is one reason why this is avoided. The reductionistic approaches that are a part of that, and case conceptualization tends to be hierarchical. When you read most of the books about case conceptualization, it's something we do to clients, often without them knowing that we're doing it to clients. And that doesn't feel very good, right? And so that's another concern that is often there. And do not choose a PowerPoint that's very easy to read here. Closing off to some of the deeper understandings as well, that it's often what happens with case conceptualization is people will do this and then they have their understanding of their client that they're going to function from. And they don't stay open to emergent things that may come about through the therapeutic relationship that are very important. And so case conceptualization in that regard can be quite limiting. It's not remaining open to emergent issues. And also the treatment planning point often focuses on techniques and of rigid planning instead of going with the moment, following what is happening in therapy and the process there. So those are all very important reasons why not to do case conceptualization. In my own practice, I don't have any interest in doing case conceptualization. But over time, my wife and I, as we talked about this, we felt that it was something important to consider for a few reasons. Now, one of the reasons was we both taught in a number of professional schools. And when you get to the comprehensive exams in a lot of professional schools, what do they ask you to do? Anyone know? Case conceptualization. So we had a number of students over the year that contacted us from schools that we taught at as well as other schools saying, how do you do this? And we'd give them kind of our own ideas. But then a number of them didn't pass their case conceptualizations and had to redo it because the professor said, we have no way to evaluate this. And what it ended up doing is it discouraged a lot of students from pursuing existential humanistic therapy because the word was, you can't pass your case conceptualization if you do this, so you better learn a different approach to therapy. Well, that we thought was pretty unfortunate. And so we thought, well, maybe there is a little bit of value in this. Many places for supervision, training programs, different things as well, you have to do case conceptualizations, and there wasn't a model out there for this. It even at times has been talked about with some states as being part of a licensing exam and different types of certification. So there were some things that we thought, well, this can help advance existential humanistic psychology's status, even if there's some limitations with this. If we can find a way to do this that remains consistent with existential humanistic values. As we talk about it more, one of the things we also thought about is, could this be used as a way to leverage in settings where existential humanistic therapy is often not allowed to be practiced. So in some community mental health centers in the United States, they will say you can't do existential humanistic therapy because there's no evidence-based foundation for it. It's not true. But maybe this can help provide a way where we can make that argument. And that's one of the things that we have worked to build into this, is how do we talk about evidence-based foundations. Now when we talk about evidence-based practice, there's a quick challenge I should mention. when evidence-based practice first started to come about, and there was a seminal article about this in the American Psychologist, what it talked about is a very broad, inclusive understanding of evidence and evidence-based practice. Now, right after that, some of the people that were part of writing that article wrote a follow-up article and said, now, if we're not careful, this broad, inclusive understanding of evidence-based practice is going to come back to a very reductionistic approach similar to the empirically supported treatments. Well, that's happened with a lot of the understandings that you see out there. But if we argue for that original broad understanding, it's very friendly, I think, to existential humanistic therapy. So there are some reasons why I think it is valuable to do this. But how do you do case conceptualization and a treatment planning in a way that's fluid, non-reductionistic, open, and that fits with existential humanistic values? That's definitely a challenge, and it maybe cannot be done perfectly. But we think that it is possible by talking about some of these ways, some of these approaches, some strategies to try and help do it in a way that is going to be more consistent with the values and approach of existential humanistic psychology. And if we can do that, I think there's going to be a number of benefits. So we began with research. We did an online survey of a number of existential humanistic therapy about what they saw, thought was important in problem identification, in case conceptualization, and in treatment planning, in both the process and content. Now, what we found is some of the people really struggled in being able to answer these questions, which is something that I think needs to be looked at a little bit more too, because we had some concerns about that people had trouble understanding some of the questions, and I think some of that has to do with existential humanistic therapists have removed themselves often so much from some of the mainstream approaches that there's confusion even about some of the language there. And while there's some good reasons for that, it also is something that is a concern. So we talked about an approach, again, really emphasizing in doing this to remain open, fluid. This is not something that you do after the first session or first couple sessions. It's something that you keep doing across time. We talked about it being a collaborative process. Now, that doesn't mean you sit in there with your case conceptualization paperwork and fill it out with the client and check with them. But instead, what is going through it, it's a process where we develop curiosities, questions, things that we want to follow up on. So it's more about stimulating interest about different possibilities than it is about saying this is what's going on with the client. Now, that's very different than what most of the mainstream approaches to case conceptualization are. It still does end up focusing us in a little bit from things that may come from us. So there is some risk just in doing that, but it is something that at the same time can be done, I think, in a little bit more fluid of a manner. We also saw it as something that, to borrow an idea from Minuchin, and others have said similar things, Rolla May said something very similar even, is that the best way to use this is to learn it and then forget it. To learn it, there's some advantages in learning to go through this. It might help to develop the vision so that we can see certain things that may be happening with our clients, but not something necessarily that is good to do with all clients. It may be something that is more valuable in those earlier stages of becoming an existential humanistic therapist than something to do in an ongoing way, though there can be situations. Again, for example, when you're arguing with an insurance company or an agency about whether it's appropriate to use existential humanistic therapy, I think this can be something can come back and ground in the argument in a language that will be more recognizable by insurance companies and agencies as far as advocating for this approach being something that can be used. So there's some reframing of what's often done. And a big reframe is shifting from determining what's going on with the client to developing curiosities about what may be going on with the client. And that, I think, is really a critical aspect of it and a foundation that I think we'll have to work with people learning this because it does become very easy. When you start talking about clients, it becomes very easy to start taking that position of we know what's going on with them, which is something that hopefully this can be used to avoid. So we think there's a number of opportunities there. Another value that we thought there is in doing this is that for some people that are interested in existential humanistic therapy, we've seen this a number of times through the years, is people say, I'm drawn to it, but that diving into that unstructured approach is difficult. Can I do that in stages? And I think there are some challenges and limitations in doing that, but I've also, in supervision, worked with a number of clients by giving them some things that helps them manage their own anxiety about this lack of structure to use temporarily. Has helped them be able to move to a place where they can let go of that structure over time. And so it's a learning process for some. I think it can be quite valuable as well. So, and the form that we developed for this as well, we do have that up. If you go to existential-therapy.com and you click on research and then existential-humanistic case conceptualization and treatment planning, there is a form that we've developed that can be used with this. And we're in the process of talking with APA Books about developing it into a two-book series, actually. I have to give Kirk some credit for this because APA Books reached out about reach out to me about possible books. And part of the reason is because Kirk's books with APA Books are some of the best-selling books with APA Books, which that, I think, says something really exciting about the. We hear often that there's no interest in existential therapy or existential humanistic therapy. Obviously, it's not true. And there's enough information to the contrary of that where APA Books has taken notice of the interest in it. And so very appreciative of Kirk for helping to really draw up that interest. So we talked with him about a two-book series, one on how to do the case conceptualization, and then a second looking at the evidence-based foundations of existential humanistic practice and doing it in a different way instead of doing it in a way of looking at randomized trials and outcome studies, looking at the components, at empathy, at genuineness, at these factors that make up existential humanistic therapy, and talking about the support for those. And in that original model of evidence-based practice that I referred to earlier, that fits with the broader conceptualization of evidence-based practice in that model. So we're hopeful that this will be something that can be used to leverage in these arguments that these are good approaches. So in the form, we have a few different sections. The first is an introduction section where we talk about the problem identification, starting with a narrative trying to draw upon the client's language. And then as you go on, it talks about the client's view, the implications of the problems. That draws in a little bit more of what is often thought of as an objective perspective, and then the option of an ICD or DSM-5 diagnosis. So what we tried to do with this is build in that flexibility, where some aspects of it are optional, but always starting by privileging the client's perspective and voice in each of the sections. That we thought was important. But there is intentional compromise, that even if you don't like the diagnosis, and some existential humanistic therapists did report that they never will diagnose, but there is the option for doing this, and that's important in some settings. And I would argue, even if you don't like diagnosis, you need to learn it, how to do it well. Because you can argue against it better when you know how to do it well than if you're just arguing against it because you don't like it on a philosophical ground. So we need to make sure that those things that we're critiquing, we have a good understanding of. And then the next part is the case conceptualization. This I'm going to have to see if I can sit down and read. And what this was drawn from the research. What did existential humanistic therapists say that they tended to look at? Client strengths, biological and physical considerations, the family and social considerations, cultural considerations, systemic issues, including issues of oppression, self-awareness and motivation, here and now, or the ability to tolerate and stay in that here and now. Some clients run from that very quickly. The existential givens, the client-therapist relationship, and the client perspectives on challenges. So these are some of the things in that section that can be looked at. But again, it's trying to look at it with hypotheses and curiosities, not labeling or assuming about the client. And that next section then is the treatment planning. In the treatment planning section, it includes a narrative of the client's desired outcome. So again, starting with it in that perspective. Now, it's one of the things that, and David Elkins talks about this beautifully, about the extra therapeutic effects. There's the therapeutic effects that often the agencies and the insurance companies want. Those don't always align with what clients want. And in my experience, particularly clients that seek out existential humanistic therapy, they often are looking for different outcomes. They aren't looking just for that symptom reduction. And I found even when you don't describe yourself as an existential humanistic therapist, they're using a lot of that jargon. The way that existential humanistic therapists tend to describe themselves draws clients that are interested in different things. So talking with some of my colleagues in the same community, that I've found it really interesting about how clients seem to, in these subtle ways, find therapists that are the right fit for them at times. But so starting with that narrative description that allows to go beyond what certain settings and insurance companies may want. The client's goals, anticipated challenges to the goals, and then the treatment goals. So what's the difference between client goals and treatment goals? Well, the client goals, that's what the client wants to accomplish through therapy. Now, if I work with insurance companies, that was something I struggled with a little bit, whether I wanted to do that. But with some of the changes of what's happening, felt it was very important, including working with some insurance companies that can be difficult to work with. In the United States, Medicaid is the insurance that many people with low incomes have. And if you want to work with a lot of people that come from challenging backgrounds, it's important to be on Medicaid. If they're on Medicaid, they're not allowed to see a therapist, even pro bono, or with self-pay. You have to go to a therapist on Medicaid. And if you're a therapist and you see with someone on Medicaid, even pro bono, you can get in trouble with licensing boards, which I think there's some oddities with that, but it's a reality of the situation. So the treatment goals are, what does the insurance company want, or the agency want? So this is a way that we can, again, compromise a little bit. Focus on what the clients want, but also if the client needs to use insurance for some reason, and many clients do. If we do, in the United States, if all you're going to work with is self-pay or pro bono, it's going to drastically impact the type of clients that you see. And for me, it's very important to work with some people that don't fall into those categories. So this is an intentional compromise, I think, that can be made that allows for a little bit more freedom in who we're able to work with at times. So the treatment goals, the important treatment considerations, and this can be the stances, approaches, strategies, and techniques to consider, and then also a section for support for that. So this is where I talked about that two-book model that we're trying to do, one on how to do the case conceptualization, and then one on the evidence-based foundations that will look at these stances, approaches that are not focusing on the more rigid techniques of some of the other approaches, but stances and approaches that fit very well with what we often talk about in existential humanistic therapy. So it's a way where we can, hopefully, in an open and fluid place, still be able to present something to agencies and insurance companies that shows here we have a problem identification and conceptualization, and with this, these stances and approaches make sense, and there's evidence to support them working, and we can use that then to advocate for the use of existential humanistic therapy in some of these settings. And then there's a final section that is additional information, and that is in part just open out of consideration that there really isn't a process where we can really fit everything in. There's things that fall out. That's part of the humanness, the messiness of human nature. So it allows for some additional freedom in there that can be used with this. So this is something that we've been working on for about 2 years now. It is something that, it's a work that honestly we never wanted to do. We're very resistant to doing. in part because it goes against the way that we want to work, but also we felt that this was something that is an important service to existential humanistic psychology. If this can start to open doors for existential humanistic therapy to be able to be practiced in some additional settings, then I think it's worth a lot of the strife and compromises and frustrations that we have with this process in order to be able to advance the field and opportunities for existential humanistic therapy. We also think that this can be something that can be used as a basis for outcome studies in existential humanistic therapy, which is something that Katarina was talking about earlier, which I do think is valuable for us to do. Now, we should critique them as we do them. I think that's a vitally important thing to do. But we can critique them as we do them, which I think can in ways provide a model for other approaches to therapy at the same time, even though they might ignore that in many ways too. But at least it does provide a model, I think, of our values of looking at the limitations with a lot of traditional outcome studies. So that's all I have. Thank you.